Welcome to the video series for the finals of the 2025 CCL, an online Heroscape league with 4 qualifiers for an annual finals event. Finals is a single elimination bracket for the 16 qualifiers. In this video, I'll go through the format, the armies and the meta, the bracket, and go over my predictions. This event is called a half draft format, but I think it's probably more accurate to call it a pod draft reinforcements or a half pod draft event. Essentially, you bring an army core, which you will play, as well as 2 partial armies called pods, which get combined with the 2 that your opponent brings. One player will end up picking first from those combined pods to combine with their army core, and the other player has the option to ban one of the 4 pods first, and then selects their pod second. This is the first time this format's been run, to my knowledge, and it's a little bit of a different one. It does seem to me to give a pretty strong advantage to whomever wins the dice-off, as banning your opponent's better pod into you is quite strong, and will probably be the correct option in most draft situations. Although there could be some situations where that doesn't end up becoming the dominant strategy. Personally, I think this probably would have been slightly more interesting as a double pick your poison event, where you choose which of your opponent's 2 pods they play, where basically both of you get to ban the stronger pod into the other person's army. But instead, this allows for the possibility of you playing one of your opponent's pods with your core, or them playing one of your pods with their core. In terms of the nuts and bolts of the format, the army core itself is 350 point cap with 16 figure cap, and the individual pods are a cap of 250 points and 8 figures. These figure limits themselves are a little bit restrictive, and it's going to be tough to get a maximum squad spam in a lot of builds. So that was definitely a key factor of the army building process here. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the players and what armies they ended up bringing for this event. So we can scroll down and see the players. I can't fit all of them on screen at once, but we'll go ahead and go through the different army cores that were brought. Let's discuss each of the army cores that was brought. We have 3 people who brought a Death Chasers army core: myself, Sheep, and Sir Heroscape. We have 3 people who brought an army core of 4th Massachusetts line: Knight of Light, Grey Waves, and Baron Scapius. We have 3 people who brought a core of Rats X2 with Raylan and then either Q9 or Incendiborgs. That was Flash Gordon, Dysol, and Swarm. We then had 2 players who brought a core of Greenskill Warriors with dragons in the sideboards. Those are Ryguy and Kozel. We have 2 people who brought a Stingers core, Morsebane and Darkleaf. We have 1 person who brought a Knights of Weston core, Pouncing Wolves. We have 1 person who brought a 10th Regiment core, 96 Z-Train, and 1 person who brought a Cathar core from OG Blaha. So let's take a look at each of these cores in turn and see what those armies look like. I'm going to start with Death Chasers, as that's the one I ended up going with. So you can see my Death Chasers army on screen here, where we have the core being 5 squads of Death Chasers with Narak and then Deflectatron as a filler. We can also take a look at the other cores of Death Chasers that we see here. So if we scroll down, we have Sheep who brought 5 squads of Death Chasers with Kuthnak. And then lower down, Sir Heroscape also brought 5 squads of Death Chasers with Kuthnak. So they have the same core there, where I have a little bit of a different core. In terms of their pods, Sheep brought the first one with Adalburn and Raylan, whereas Sir Heroscape paired Adalburn with Narak and 2 Swogs instead. For Sheep's second pod, it's another squad of Chasers with Miburksa, Narak, and Pel the Hill Giant, so a bunch of Bonders. And Sir Heroscape's final option has 2 squads of Death Chasers there with Miburksa and Raylan. So a little bit of a different takes there. Sheep went with putting Raylan and Adalburn in the same pod, which is a little bit more of an all-in strategy, where I think Sheep's best possible army here is probably the best army in the whole event, if he gets to be able to choose his own Adalburn plus Raylan core. In terms of my take on this, going back up to my army here, I also put Adalburn with Raylan. I thought that that was just really strong. If you win the dice-off, you basically are guaranteed to be able to get that full army, and it's just amazing. I put Kuthnak in one of the sides instead of having him in the main, and had Narak in the main instead. I was trying to build 2 armies that were a little bit more of complete cohesive armies. So one option for me here is the Death Chasers with Adalburn, Narak, and Raylan, so the defensive, slowly push forward pod, And the other option is 7 Death Chasers with Narak and Kuthnak and Miburksa. So maximum Death Chasers with Kuthnak, just trying to charge out there. And then for that one, I don't have Raylan or Adalburn. Now, is Adalburn and Kuthnak great? Yes, they're both great. One of the downsides to my construction of this is that I don't have the option to get Adalburn and Kuthnak in the same build, whereas Sheep and Heroscape do. So, a little bit of different takes there. I'm curious to see which version of that ends up actually being stronger in the event. The next army core that was brought was 4th, with 3 different people all bringing the same exact army. So we'll just take a look at Knight of Light's version here, because they're all identical. The core of that is 4 squads of 4th Mass with Sam Brown, with the sideboards being either 2 more squads of 4th Mass with Alistair, which completes the Valiant bonus, or Quahan with Morgan's Rifleman, where the idea is you suicide open Quahan, trade her for as much stuff as possible, and then after that have Valiant 4th Mass for the rest of the game. It's a good army. I like the fact that it has 2 very different options if they win the dice off to be able to choose between. If Quahan's going to be really good into your opponent's army, you can go with the Quahan version, and if not, you can go with the second 4th Mass option. Now, one of the downsides to it is your opponent could potentially take Quahan in this draft as well. If your opponent has a core that already has like Raylan and Rats in it or something like that, they might just take Quahan because Quahan's pretty good. So that's definitely something to watch out for there. But all in all, this is certainly a very strong build. The next core we'll look at is Rats X2 with Raylan and then either Q9 or Incendiborgs. There's 2 different takes on this. Flash Gordon brought this with Incendiborgs, whereas Dysol brought it with Q9, and Swarm also brought it with Q9. In terms of the sideboards, Dysol added Incendiborgs and Brute as one side option, with Laglor, Krav, and another squad of Rats as the other one. So either trying to counter melee harder with the Brutes and the Incendiborgs, or counter range harder with Laglor and the Krav and the Rats. I'm a big fan of this army. I think it also has 2 really good options where it can either hard counter melee or hard counter range. And I think having 2 flex options like that is really important in a format like this. Looking at Swarm's version of it, we have Maladrix in the first option and Heracles with Mara Warriors in the second option. Maladrix is a cool one as well. It definitely gives you a tech piece if your opponent has a big king unit that you want to just go infest and then watch them eventually chest burst. Heracles is also a nice tech piece, but it's kind of a similar tech piece to Maladrix, where they both kind of counter like a big, heavy-hitting hero. So there's a little bit more of overlap there in Swarm's army. Mara Warriors are a bit of a risky play in a timed event, which this is. It'll have 75-minute rounds. I'm always going to be more of a fan of Mara Warriors in an untimed event, like an OHS season, than in any kind of a timed event, just because you might end up losing on partial card scoring at the end of the game, even if you were almost certainly going to win the game with Mara Warriors after that. Flash Gordon's pods are a little different. We have the first one is Greyspirits with Arctos. I love me some Varks, so hard to argue with that. The second one is Krug with Tagawa Samurai. It's interesting. Krug has some tech ability into big things, but I just don't think this pod itself is very strong and probably won't get played too much. I think if Flash loses the dice off and they ban the Greyspirit Arctos pod, it's just going to be tough for Flash to fill out that army, and it'll end up being mostly just the Incendiborgs behind 2 squads of Rats. So I think Flash is a little more vulnerable to losing the dice off than the other 2 versions of this build are. Next up, let's look at the Dragon builds. So if we scroll down, Rygai and Kozel brought the Dragon builds. Both of them have a core of Greenscale Warriors. Rygai has 3 squads of Greenscale Warriors with Raylan and Mara Warriors, whereas Kozel went with 4 Greenies and just Raylan there. Different takes on the same concept. Mara Warriors are obviously amazing. I know Rygai likes to open Mara Warriors a lot in this build, which mitigates some of their downside of getting timed out in the late game, so I do expect Rygai will be able to get a ton of value out of Maros in that build. Their sideboards are identical. One option is Nilfheim with Brute, and the other is Quahan with another squad of Greenscale Warriors. So, very similar concepts from Rygai and Kozel there. The only difference was, do you want Maros in the core, or do you want one more squad of Greenies in the core? So cool takes there. One of the nice aspects of this is it's very immune to the banning process. You're going to get one of your 2 dragons with your core, and the dragons are pretty similar in terms of what they're good or bad into. There's definitely some matchups where you'd rather have the Brute or rather have the extra Greenies, but on the whole, this core is much more immune to the banning process than most other armies, which is definitely a nice component. And Raylan plus Dragon plus Screen is also just really good. It happens to be pretty good into Q9 specifically, which is a nice aspect in this format where we have all those Q9s running around as well. So definitely a strong army, and it makes sense to see it represented. Next up, we have two people who brought a Maro Stingers core. So if we go back up to Morspain's army first, we have 5 squads of Stingers with Miburxa, and I'm a little bit confused as to why Miburxa is there, to be honest. In terms of the sideboards, we have 2 Fen Hydras, which could be quite strong into certain things, and then Cyprian with Raylan. I don't love these combos, though, because Cyprian and Raylan don't necessarily work together. Raylan is great with the Stingers, but Cyprian generally wants to be flying around the map quite freely, and isn't going to get the benefits of having Raylan as much. I think this would have been better served to have Raylan with 1 Hydra in one side, and then Cyprian with something else that fits Cyprian's playstyle better in the other one. Going down to the other Stingers build, we have 4 squads of Maro Stingers with Raylan, and I think this is probably a better version of the core. Raylan's just good. You just want Raylan. It's a good thing to have. For the first side, we have Hydra with 2 squads of Stingers, and I like this version better than what we saw above, because you have access now to 6 Stingers, Raylan, and a Hydra, which is a pretty strong army all on its own. The other option here is Q9 with Brute Gruts. So that would play quite differently, where you would end up having Q9 almost behind a Stinger screen of sorts for big portions of the game, with Brute Gruts being able to counter melee quite strongly. So if I had to choose between these 2 Stingers options, I think Darkleaf has the stronger version of it, but I'm also not sure that Stingers are just quite strong enough to compete in this overall meta, at least compared to those top 4 army cores that we've already looked at. Next up, we have 3 one-off armies, so let's scroll back up, and we see Pouncing Wolves brought Knights of Weston. So the core is 3 squads of Knights with Gilbert and Eldgrim. Solid. For the sideboards, we have Q9 with 1 more squad of Knights. It's interesting. You end up getting 4 squads of Knights basically as an offensive screen for Q9, but the problem is you don't have access to Raylan for Q9, which is a bit of a problem. Also, your opponent could just steal this pod, and then they get Q9. That could be a problem, especially if they have Raylan in a screen already in their core. Next up, we have 2 squads of 4th Mass Line with Raylan, and I gotta say I don't like this option very much. I think that 3 squads of Knights with 2 squads of 4th just isn't enough to compete with the core amount of offense that you're going to get out of a more cohesive build. It's just too easy to lose 4 or 5 4th and then not be able to put any more order markers on them. There's just too many armies that can do that easily. Any of the Q9 builds, really any of the dragons, once they get that first shot in, they're just going to kill a lot of the 4th. And so I personally have some reservations about the strength level of this army. Next, let's take a look at 96 Z-Train, who brought a core of 10th Regiment. So here we have 10th Regiment with Raylan as the core, and then for the sides, we have Maladrix with her Festering Honor Guard. That's the second time we've seen that copy. And the second one is Adalburn with 2 squads of Ashra. Again, I don't entirely understand what these armies are going for. I get Maladrix. Maladrix makes some sense to counter some specific things, but non-bonding Adalburn just isn't there. 2 squads of Ashra is definitely solid, and could be a good screen in front of Raylan, but I think that non-bonding Adalburn is just going to be way too hard to get anywhere near the amount of value you need to out of him. If your opponent has any kind of range, they're able to draw him outside of Raylan's aura, and now he's just a 3 defense non-bonding hero. Admittedly a very good one, but just not quite unlocking the potential of Adalburn there. I will say I also considered a 10th Regiment build fairly strongly for this event, but it was quite different than this. The version that I was looking at was the same core, essentially, so Raylan with 3 squads of 10th. For the sideboards, one would have been 2 more squads of 10th with Marcus, and the other would have been Major Q9 with Maro Warriors. I think that that gives you more options for having 2 very strong builds and getting much closer to max value out of all of the units within that. It also gives you the option, if you win the dice-off, to get 10th Reg X5 with Raylan and Marcus if you're facing a melee army, which is basically an auto-win if you're able to pull that off. And in a format like this, having the upside of auto-wins with less downside is usually going to be the right call to go with. The last army that we have represented here is the Cathar Spearmen, brought by OG Blaha, where the core is 3 squads of Cathar with Raylan, and then for the sideboards we have 3 squads of Greatbows, or Q9 with Simon Fraser. I think that the Q9 version of this army is quite strong, so Q9 behind 3 squads of Cathar, especially if you're facing off against a melee army where they have to go through all of those braced spears. However, I don't think the Greatbows army is quite strong enough. It's not very good into melee, which means that if you end up facing melee, yes, you have those 12 Cathar, but Greatbow's at getting only 2 attacks per turn in just isn't going to be enough to get the numbers for you there. And so I'm not sure that the Greatbow's option is quite the best way to go. In terms of the armies that I considered that didn't end up making the top cut, I think the most viable one was a Rygarn combo, where the core of the army was Rygarn, Q9, and Raylan. And then the 2 sideboards were Laglor with Krav, and then some filler, or Brutes with Hydra, and then some filler. The problem with this ends up being that the point totals for those 2 sideboards aren't great. They have a lot of points left over, and you don't really have much of a screen, which is a bit of a problem if you end up facing something like the Death Chasers build, where you really need a screen to delay them from being able to come in and do maximum damage. So I didn't end up going with it because of that lack of a screen, and I imagine others had similar thought processes if they considered an army like that as well. I also gave a lot of thought to running a heavies build, because of course I did, I like heavies, but I didn't think that the total was great for them, and I thought that this total ended up being much better for Death Chasers, with the way that they could pivot to multiple different army options, because Death Chasers are a little bit more suited towards that than heavies are, where the heavies really just want Grimnack Narak and then as many heavies as they can fit. So I think that this was just better for Chasers than heavies, and I think that that's probably why you don't see any heavies represented in this build overall. So that's the overview of the meta and the armies. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the bracket. Let's go through the bracket quadrant by quadrant. Let's first take a look at the top left. We have Sheep playing 96 Z-Train. Sheep has one of the Death Chasers builds, and 96 Z-Train has the 10th build. Now 10th could be quite strong here, if they had access to more 10th reg with, say, Marcus. But I think that Sheep is going to end up being favored here into this less optimized version of the 10th build, and so I'm predicting Sheep to win that game. The other game in this quadrant is Morsebane versus Grey Waves, where Morsebane has one of the Stingers builds, and Grey Waves has one of the 4th builds. In general, 4th are going to trade pretty well into Stingers because they're just making more attacks per turn. That being said, Stingers can certainly roll hot, and Stingers backed by Raylan is a lot of defense for 4th to get through. Ultimately, I think I just like Grey Wave's army more overall. I think it's the stronger army, and I think Morsebane's build has some deficiencies in it, and so because of that, I ended up going with Grey Waves in this matchup. That would then be Sheep versus Grey Waves, where Sheep has the Death Chasers and Grey Waves has the 4th. Now, one thing that's important in this matchup is Kuthnak. I actually think my matchup into 4th Mass is a lot worse than Sheep or Sir Heroscape's because I can lose access to Kuthnak, whereas they can't, because Kuthnak is in their core. Now, the important thing about Kuthnak here is that Kuthnak allows you to boil a Death Chaser into the 4th pod from outside of the Wait Then Fire range, which means that you don't have to move your pod into Wait Then Fire range. You can just ping one dude at a time in and throw lots of dice into the 4th Mass as they sit. Or potentially have Miberxa take out a key piece of that, and then ship a boiled dude into that spot and whirlwind even more guys. So I think that Sheep and Sir Heroscape both have good matchups there into 4th, and so I'm picking Sheep to win that one. Moving to the top right side of this bracket now, we have OG Blaha playing Kozil. OG has the Cathar build, and Kozil has one of the Dragon builds. Cathar are pretty weak into dragons specifically, because the dragons can sit behind a screen and attack them, and the Cathar will have to fight through all of those green scales in order to get there. So I think this is a pretty good matchup for Kozil, and that's who I'm picking to win it. The other game up there is Baron Scapius versus Sir Heroscape, where Baron Scapius has one of the 4th builds and Sir Heroscape has the Death Chasers. Much like the Sheep versus Grey Waves matchup, I think that because Sir H is guaranteed to have access to Kuthnak, I like the Death Chasers there, and so I'm picking Sir H to win that one. That then gives us Kozil versus Sir Heroscape with the Dragon versus Death Chasers. Death Chasers are a pretty good army into the Dragon. We saw a lot of copies of that in this most recent Vichi's 6th season, and so I'm going to pick the Death Chasers there as well, and I have Sir H moving on. That then gives us Sheep versus Sir Heroscape in the semifinals from that top bit there. They have pretty similar armies. I ended up picking Sheep here, though, because I think Sheep has access to the slightly stronger version of the army if he wins the dice-off. Whereas Sir Heroscape, I think, has a little bit less upside there than Sheep does for winning the dice-off, and so because of that, I ended up giving a slight edge to Sheep in that matchup. Now, let's take a look at the bottom half of the bracket. I'm going to start on the bottom right here, with Pouncing Wolves versus Knight of Light. As you can see, I had picked Knight of Light to win this matchup originally, but as it happened, Knight of Light had to drop out of this event, and so Pouncing Wolves will actually be getting a bye through there instead. and so this matchup isn't going to happen. The other game down there is Rygai versus Daisol, and this is a tough matchup for me to choose. This was probably the one I was most torn about in the entire first round. Rygai has the other dragon build, and Daisol has Q9 Rats Raylan, with two really good options to pair with it. I think that both options give Daisol a lot of play into Rygai's build, and so I think that Daisol's not that vulnerable to losing the dice off. Obviously, neither is Rygai, because he could just go with either dragon. Ultimately, I went with Daisol in this matchup. I think she has a lot of good army pieces to be able to try to kill the dragon with, although Q9 is not great into dragons in general, so that's a little bit of a hindrance to Daisol's army there. This is the pick that I think I'm most likely to get wrong, though, in the first round. That would then give us Daisol versus Pouncing Wolves, where Pouncing has the Knights of Weston build, and Daisol has the Q9 Raylan Rats with Friends options. Ultimately, I think Daisol's army is just stronger overall than Pouncing's is, and so I would pick Daisol in that matchup. On the other quadrant, down in the bottom left, that's where I'm at. We have me versus Darkleaf. So I have one of the Death Chasers builds, and Darkleaf has a Stingers build. Now, Stingers are actually fairly good at killing heroes, so Stingers could put a lot of wounds on Adelburn, though if I'm playing the Adelburn version, I'm also going to have Raylan with it, and 8 life, 5 defense is just a ton. I do think this is a fairly good matchup for me overall, regardless of whether I win the dice off. I think that Kuthnak gives me a lot of play in terms of being able to ship dudes into the Stingers as they develop, and Adelburn Raylan is just so good that I think either version of it probably has me as a favorite in this matchup, maybe a fairly significant one, and I'm picking myself to win that one. The other game in that quadrant is Flash Gordon versus Swarm. This is actually the Raylan Rats mirror, where Swarm has Q9 in the core and Flash Gordon has Incendiborgs in the core. A little bit unfortunate for both of them that they got matched up against each other instead of, say, 4th Mass, where they have a much stronger matchup. I ended up picking Swarm there just because I thought that version of the build was slightly more optimized than Flash Gordon's, but that could definitely go either way, as these are very similar armies. That would then have me facing Swarm. And this is actually not an amazing matchup for me because Adelburn can't chop large. That being said, though, I still have just so much offense and so much efficiency in my build that I think I'll be able to pull out the win there if I'm facing that matchup, and so I did pick myself there. That would then be me versus Daisol. And I think this is even closer than me versus Swarm would be, because again, I think Daisol has the stronger version of that build. I ended up picking myself here. This, along with the Rygai versus Daisol game in round 1, are probably the two games that I was the least confident in my picks with, so hard to tell there. Obviously, I hope I win it, but I think that this would be a very close matchup, and would be a fun game to play. That would then be me versus Sheep in the finals, which is a near mirror, and for what it's worth, there's a separate prize for winning this event and for having the best bracket. So I don't actually want to pick myself to win in my own bracket, because I want to have the chance to win that prize if I lose the overall event. So I ended up picking Sheep to win this one in the near mirror, and I have Sheep taking down the event. We'll see how right or wrong these predictions are. I am curious to find out. I'm recording this the day before the event, so the event is tomorrow, and I am looking forward to playing it. It should be a fun time, and we'll see how these armies do. Thanks to Sir Heroscape for putting on this event. Peace, y'all.